So, hi, everyone. This is our first general meeting of final cohort presentations. Today, we have 5 awesome presentations. And with that, Cedric, if you'd like to share your screen, and we'll be starting with the Entrepreneurship, Investment, and Innovation and Antitrust cohort.
All right. So if people can't see that, then let me know. But so yes, so we're the Entrepreneurship, Innovation, and Antitrust cohort, and we three of our cohort members, in addition to April and I, who are the leaders of this cohort, worked on this presentation and our paper, but none of the members could make it this evening, so just April and I will be going over our question and results and discussion and all that. And if you have any questions, we can do our best to answer them. Okay, so the title of our project is Intellectual Property as an Intellectual Barrier, and Examination of Patents as Knowledge-Based Barriers to Entry. So kind of the background of this and why we chose to do this topic as this for this cohort with the theme we have is we read a lot of papers in the fall and winter about patents and their use as a legal barrier to entry. So when one way to think about patents is basically you innovate, and part of the incentive to innovate is that you have control of the market you create with your product for a certain number of years, and the government grants you a monopoly over the innovation you've made, so you don't have to worry about competing. And so competition occurs to create products because people are striving for that kind of state sanctioned monopoly. And so there's been lots of research about this and about the incentives of patents as this temporary monopoly. And there has been less research kind of thinking about patents in another way, which is representing a knowledge-based barrier to entry. So presumably industries where there's lots of innovation and ideas are patentable, and you're making something that the US Patent Office, US Patent and Trademark Office determines is a patentable invention, there's a certain there's a certain amount of knowledge required to create something that's patent worthy. And so we're trying to look at kind of that relationship and see if patents impose a knowledge-based barrier to entry, or better wording might be not only impose, but kind of represent a knowledge-based barrier to entry. So to explore this, we have several data sources. The first is patent and is a panel data set on the number of patents attributable to each university in the United States. And so the angle we're kind of trying to take is thinking about patents and connected to universities and knowledge-based industries as if there's a higher proportion of those where there are more universities, then maybe universities as a kind of represent some proxy for a knowledge required to make a patentable innovation. So the first data source is the actual number of patent data at the university level. And then we use data from the BEA, and this is city by industry level compensation data. So it allows us to, in conjunction, so among these industries in this data set, we identify ones that are knowledge-based using the criterion established in this paper. And we identify, look at the relationship between knowledge-based industry compensation in a city and the number of universities that there are to kind of, the number of university patents there are to see if the relationship between patents associated with universities indicate that or are correlated with higher compensation in these knowledge-based industries. And so we just link this together. Cities, we link cities to universities with this data set here. And so from these, we kind of create a final merged panel data set of observations at the city by year level with these two key variables. So number of patents attributable to universities, and then the total compensation across what we've identified as these knowledge-based industries. And kind of just for the sake of, due to the time constraint for this project, we only used 4 states or looked at cities within 4 states. And you can see the kind of time trend here of patents attributable to universities in each year. And I guess there are more universities in New York and California than in the data set that have patents than in Illinois and Texas. And this is similarly in the cities within these states, the compensation time trend. Okay, and then this is the model we use. So we just use like a simple model with fixed effects. And then we also did a linear log model, so to get semi-elasticity, so our coefficient could be interpreted as a semi-elasticity. And we do get we have the statistically significant relationship between the number of patents attributable to universities in a city and the compensation and knowledge-based industries in that city. And so these are just kind of plots of those two relationships of the coefficients from our model. Okay, and I guess April can talk about the many limitations of our analysis.
Okay, thank you, Cedric. So as you see, we had like a very naive regression, and the data availability is like quite limited. So I guess although there's like a significant positive correlation between university patents and compensation in knowledge-based industries, we still have we are still kind of far from really making a conclusion that's regarding the barriers to entry imposed by patents. Because first of all, as we see, the compensation in knowledge-based industries is actually not a very good measure of business dynamism. So we probably would like to have better data regarding business dynamism and firms' entry and exit. So this is like one point that's limited by data. And also university patent does not cover all the research and development related activities that are in each region. So there are many research institutions and many other sources that we didn't count as sources of patents. And for the model, I guess a better improvement later will be probably, as you saw in the data, there's like a shock in California while there's no such shock in other states. So probably if we can figure out what makes the shocks and make it diff and diff, it will be like we can make stronger arguments. So that's the conclusions and limitations. Yes, so this page somehow repeats what I just said. So that's basically what our project is doing. Thank you. Are we out of time? Let's see.
There's not a particular time thing. I think Lisi has a question.
Yeah.
Yes. So you kind of already said this, but can you go back to the model? So my question kind of is, I mean, you already said this, Yunshuk, but this is no causal basis, right? Like there's no causal argument being made by just putting fixed effects.
No. There's not. It's like purely descriptive.
Okay.
I guess like an instrument will also be helpful, but currently we don't really have such data.
Yeah, I
And
mean, you don't even need an instrument though. Like you could just do, as you said, a diff and diff of some sort, possibly with the shock in California, and that has a causal basis.
yeah, definitely.
So like, I think just from would an econometrician be happy? Just to make the econometrician happy, it would be nice to make this causal.
Yeah,
you know,
definitely.
Yeah.
I think making causal inference is kind of beyond what our cohort members, who are mostly first years, ability, but it's like a very so the current model does not have the causal.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just saying it's.
If I may make a recommendation really quickly. So if you have that, so you have that shock that occurs in California, and I'm presuming the BEA also has data on the compensation for non-knowledge based industries. So you could just do that over the two differences, the knowledge-based industries and the non-knowledge based ones, and the like pre and post shock. And I mean, that's still not going to be perfect because there's no necessary reason for that shock to be exogenous. But that would still, I think, maybe add a little more to your analysis and would be I mean, I don't know how much cleaning will be required from the BEA data, but might not be like too much of a next step in some sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and even if the assumption is not necessarily incredibly plausible, it's clear what the assumption is. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
I think you need to stop sharing before the next group can share.
Hello, we are the labor and consumption group.
Oh, hold on. There we go.
Okay, so our focus is that we want to find out about how an increase in funding in public schools can affect graduation rates. So we are looking at a specific policy that we found in a paper done by Professor Michael Dinerstein called Quantifying the Supply Response of Private Schools to Public Policies. And so in his paper, he observes how a specific policy in New York City schools changes how different variables, such as how the private school supply reacts in response to this policy. And we specifically looked at his data sets that he provided us to understand how he came to his result. And we are going to take this a step further by looking at how this policy specifically affects graduation rates. And so we are looking at a variable that he didn't observe specifically. So next slide, Rebecca. So just to provide a refresher on what his paper covered, he studied specifically the Fair Student Funding Reform in New York City, which was enforced in 2008. And so the independent variable was that there was an increased funding to some public schools, depending only on student characteristics. So because of the hold harmless clause, no public schools would be losing out. So there is a formula that was used to calculate the funding. And if the school would have less funding than before the policy, then they would just use their old funding. So in the paper, they observed how this funding affects how much money we would spend on each student and what results from that. And so Dinerstein found a couple of results, but specifically he focuses on how the supply of private schooling changes in response to this policy. And what he found was actually that if a public school received an increase of funding as a result of the policy, then the private schools in the area, there was actually a decrease in the private school supply over the following years. And so what we want to see, we want to observe a different variable change in reaction to this policy change, and the specific variable that we want to observe changing, if it does change, is graduation rates.
Sorry, I was muted. So our empirical method / identification is almost identical to the paper, to what is written in the paper. Our structural model has literally this Y variable, and in our case is going to be the graduation rate. regressed on funding per student, plus some sort of controls that he has in the data. And then, yeah, and then because like funding per student is like, is very like endogenous in that like, I don't know, like richer families might choose to go to like schools with better funding, or like public schools with better funding. Like all of our data is based on, all of our data is from public schools. And then, which is why like on top of a diff and diff, they're using an IV. So they're using FSF, and like, which is like this new funding policy that was issued in 2008, which is also the shock in the paper, to instrument for funding per student due to endogeneity. And like we had talked about earlier, because there's this hold harmless cause, so you would the changes in your funding will essentially be zero if you're actually going to be hurt by this new policy. And then if you're going to get more funding through this policy, your treatment is going to be like a positive number. So that's kind of the diff and diff treatment. And then, so essentially it's going to be an IV on top of a diff and diff, and then we're evaluating diff and diff based on like the reduced form, if that makes any sense. So the first stage of the diff and diff, the first stage of the IV is going to be that our projected fund is to use like our projected funding, which is the FSF, which is the new calculation of the funding. So this is our instrument. We're using this instrument for like funding per student. And then our reduced form is just going to be like Y regressed on like a bunch of different different controls, and FSF, the FSF instrument. And then later on, he also controlled for like other things for robustness checks. But then the basic idea is just that we're using projected funding to instrument for funding per student. And then the projected funding is a random shock from a policy. So yeah. Next slide.
Okay, so he uses different types of data sources in his paper, such as listed here, like student level data for public schools. The data sets that we specifically worked with that he sent us is school level data, where we could see like funding changes from the years and see the projected budget changes. And so the data that we are adding on top of his data is from the New York City Public School Report Card. And basically it's just data that covers years preceding and following the implementation of the policy change. So we can see how the policy change might affect graduation rates. So it has a lot of metrics, some of which are also used in the nursing papers, such as the ELA and math achievement scores. But our central focus is going to be on how the policy affects the graduation rates. So we're just merging that with the data sets he provided us.
Yeah, I guess here's a status check on where we are exactly. So we I guess fall winter quarter, we completed our empirical understanding of Dennyson's paper. And then after we got his data, we were able to replicate the regressions that were provided in the paper using the data that he gave us. And we got pretty similar results. There were some like minor discrepancies, but they weren't like in the area of just like, I guess they weren't concerning. And then we also collected data for performance metrics, as Nicole mentioned. This was from the New York City database and education, basically like the New York City Public School Report Card. And then we cleaned this data, like prepared it, and then looked through like different dependent variables that we could look at for our Y variable. And we're about to run our regressions. We haven't exactly run them yet, but we plan on doing that very soon. So we're able to like write the final paper in conjunction with the research that we've done so far. And I guess here's a brief overview of like the relevant literature relating to how increased funding affects like public school education and how our sort of research slots into this. So there have been two main papers like regarding how like increased funding affects education. The first one is by Jackson et al. And it talks about funding from, I believe, the 1970s and 1980s. And this paper basically states that like, a 10% increase in funding per pupil increases like outcomes pretty drastically. But how this paper differs from ours is that one is from the 1970s and 1980s, and two, it covers K through 12, while our specific like research covers just high schools because we want to look at high school graduation rates. Another thing to note is that the amount of funding that like the specific funding change that they're studying is different from the funding change that we're studying, because I guess in terms of magnitude, like 10% in terms of people like funding increases like around $500 back then, but the metric we're looking at is closer to around $1,000 of funding per student. That's the second main paper that's important, is Left Returning at all. And they basically talk about how increased funding affects people specifically in low-income school districts, which also differs from our research because we're looking at New York City in general. So we're segregating based off of a geographic area, not like socioeconomic status. But they also find, similar to the first paper, that basically increased funding does improve school performance, which makes sense. Slide. I guess our contribution is that we're the sort of like, we sort of build upon like the most recent data like available in large quantities with the shock, which is like from post 2005. And then we're also focusing on high school graduation rate, which is a metric that other papers haven't looked at. They looked at things that are similar, such as amount of years added by school, I guess amount of years in school added, but I think there are still differences between like graduation rates and like amount of years added in school because, yeah. And then I guess looking forward for how we can improve our model in the future, I think, first of all, the main thing is just to consider other factors that could affect graduation rates, because the model we're using, basically, we're replacing the original Y variable, which was increase in test scores. We're replacing that with graduation rates, but obviously, like, the two things are different, so the model might have to change slightly. And I guess we also want to figure out the minor discrepancies between our regressions and his regressions. And that's about it. So we're just looking forward to our regressions next week. Thank you for listening and coming to our presentation.
Do you guys have any questions?
Yeah, I'm just a little bit curious about the instrument. Can you just explain?
Yes. Okay. Like the paper was being very opaque about this. So this is basically just that, like, this is our structural model. So this is what the paper is actually trying to do. We're trying to find the relationship between like funding per student and like this, whatever Y variable this is. Like in the paper, he's explored like a couple different Y variables, like public school, private school supplies, and then also like various like academic outcomes. Like in our paper, this Y variable is going to be graduation rate. But then there's a problem to this model in that funding per student is highly endogenous. Like rich families might choose to go to schools that are better funded. So in this case, like we have this like sort of natural shock, which is a policy that is implemented in 2008, which is this FSF. This stands for something school funding. So they're basically just trying to like, they came up with this new formula to kind of distribute funds to different schools. Because previously the funds were distributed kind of like arbitrarily, like due to like historical and political reasons. And now they're trying to recalculate this kind of like funding based on this new formula. So this is like a significant change in like funding per student that is kind of random, that just happened in 2008 out of nowhere. So this is kind of like a random shock that we could use to instrument for funding per student. And then we need to first check our first stage is to show that this actually shifts this variable. So like this projected funding per student, which is the result of the calculation, actually shifts funding per student, right? So this is our first stage. And then because this policy is designed in a way that has this like hold harmless effect, which is kind of like if the new policy gives you less funding than before, you get to keep your original funding. So like these are basically just our control groups. Like these schools are not affected by the policy. And then the treated groups are the schools whose funding does get changed because of this. And then their funding gets increased, right? So we have this like random shock that shifts this like X variable, which is funding per student. And then we could sort of just have this like diff and diff treatment, and that like we have a control group and then we have a treatment group, and then we're interacting this with the post variable. like post is basically just an indicator variable that is 1 if you're in like the post period, that is, and is 0 that if you're in the pre period. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Because yeah, I'm in Einstein's class this quarter, so he also advertised for his paper in one of his lectures. So I'm very interested.
Okay.
I have a
Great
question.
presentation.
Lucy, you had a question?
Yeah, so what's the control group again?
The control group is basically just the results of the hold harmless clause. So if based on the new calculation, you would receive less funding than you would before, then you get to keep your original funding. So there's no change in the amount of funding that you
I guess so
receive.
the point is there is no group whose funding gets reduced.
Yes.
So the assumption here is that like that this is so that the schools are not inherently different. The schools that didn't have their funding reduced and the schools that, I mean, not that the schools that had their funding increased and the schools that didn't have their funding increased are not inherently
I
different.
mean, this is kind of like an assumption that they didn't really justify, but then they did say that like because of historical issues, like the funding schools received are kind of arbitrary, and that like it's based on like historical and political issues. So like when you have this new shock, and then you're basically just trying to like recalculate the fundings that school receive. So that's kind of random in a sense. That's how they're justifying their IV. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like, I see the argument. I don't know whether I believe it, but
yeah, like of course, like you have every reason to like object to this IV and argue that it's not like random or whatnot, but it's just
it's not that the instrument is not random, more so that the original schools who have funding are non-random.
Yeah, right.
So
yeah, I mean, the original schools, or like the schools who are kind of in a way worse off based on this new policy, are kind of non-random. You could argue that so the control group is not totally random, hence the treatment group is not totally random, hence the IV is not totally random. Like you could make arguments like that, but there's
no. I'm just saying like it's a good argument. I'm just saying like maybe it would be nice to make clear what the assumption is. I mean, you said it verbally, but like maybe you
like in the paper.
Yeah. Or like in the
sure.
presentation
Like
of the paper.
He does give an argument in the paper, but
I was just going to ask if you guys could wrap it up a bit so that we can in the next presentation. Sorry.
Oh yeah, sorry.
You can discuss this. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Good discussion, but I think right now you're talking past each other a little. So,
sorry.
No worries. So I think you need to stop share. Yeah, it's easy.
Great. So yeah, we're the central banking and monetary policy cohort. So we actually have 2 presentations in place. So I'll just go through the hopefully shorter one first. Yeah, so share screen. So this presentation is done by, this project is done by myself, Charles, and Matthew. Matthew, he just got his 2nd dose of vaccine, so unfortunately he's a bit unwell, won't be able to be present, and Charles is in another meeting. So yeah, I'll just quickly go through this, and then we'll move on to our second project with presentations. Okay, so our overall research question is to examine the impact of Fed's unconventional monetary policy announcements on household expectation vis-a-vis traditional interest rate type policy announcements. So the whole context is that since the 2008 financial crisis, the Fed or central banks around the world kind of employed a series of unconventional policy tools in response to the challenging monetary environment characterized by the low secular interest rate environment as well as the zero lower bound. So one of the tools employed was actually this strengthening of role of central bank communications. So the central bank will actually talk about the projections of the economy as well as the policy intentions in a more explicit way in the hope of influencing consumers or other economic agents' expectations and their, subsequently their behaviors. So the idea of expectation kind of takes up a very special place in macro policy literature. Well, I think many of you guys should be familiar with the concept of rational expectations, just like kind of the assumption in many of the macro models you guys learn in 202 that agents are super smart, they can look into the future, and their expectations are model consistent. But recently there have also been literature looking at whether monetary communications can influence households' expectations in rather subjective ways, right? And some of the researchers, including Professor Michael Weber, who's our advisor, kind of employ the randomized control trial to kind of explore this paradigm. So our attempt at contributing to this strand of literature views on all these, and we're going to examine the relative impact of different types of monetary policy announcements on the economic expectations of agents, right? So in particular, consumers and households. So we're looking at the panel data of New York Fed survey of consumer expectations, which basically provides, basically individual-based panel data on their month-to-month kind of expectations on a number of variables. So for this project, we focus on inflation expectations, 1 year ahead, household income growth expectations, and household spending growth expectations, which are apparently variables of strong macroeconomic interest, the Euler equation and stuff. Okay, so we categorized monetary policy announcements since 2014, I guess, which is kind of the starting date of the collection of the data, into 3 groups. Which basically the first of 4, is like the middle one. It's like FFR change. It's like the very conventional, I drop interest rate, I don't tell you anything. You just, if you're interested, you read on the newspaper, I drop interest rate, that's that kind. And the one kind of box is like forward guidance. It's like the central bank also made certain communications about, make it more high profile, and also make some suggestions on likely future course of monetary policy. And the third one is like a combo, right? Forward guidance and FFR change. So we want to investigate whether each of these type of announcements influence households' economic expectations, and if there are any differences in the relative magnitudes. Okay. So this is a very rudimentary regression in a sense. So it leverages on basically the panel data. So basically there are 2 indicator variables, signifying the presence of, the 2 more interesting kind of announcements. And we also control for time fixed effect, as well as a number of other control variables on an individual level. So the idea is that, the variables of interest are beta 1 and beta 2. So it basically captures the, average difference in terms of magnitude of forward guidance and combined forward guidance with FFR from the baseline group, which is FFR. Okay. So yeah, we employed magnitude as our measure of changes in expectations, and we take the log difference to arrive at a semi-elasticity kind of interpretation. Okay, this is very kind of crude because I think our group ran it in Python. So, but the whole story is that if you look at the p-values, many of basically the results are kind of insignificant from our base in terms of our baseline model. So yeah, this suggests that, and the p-value is kind of consistent, right, across all 3 kind of categories. So unfortunately, we didn't arrive at a very significant projection. I mean, significant coefficient. So yeah, insignificant result. And we kind of conducted robustness checks through dropping more outliers and increasing window for eligible data collection. Yeah, and unfortunately, we kind of obtained similar results. Oh, this is like insignificant. The results, the statistical results are insignificant, but it doesn't mean that the project results are insignificant. because if you look at many of the existing literature, we're kind of consistent that there are many concerns about the differentiated impact of monetary policy announcements on expectations of different types of economic agents. So in particular, many research have kind of raised questions on to what extent monetary policy announcement can actually shift household expectations. And in a sense, our result is kind of reviews that based on this survey data, different types of monetary policy announcement does not systematically correlate with magnitude of changes to consumer expectations, at least comparatively. Right? So this raises questions on transmission channel of expectation formation of monetary policy announcements. Yeah, so that's all. Yeah, welcome any questions, or if not, we can move on to the next presentation.
Could you go back to the regression page for a bit?
Sure.
So like, what is the identification method like?
So the identification method is kind of a difference kind of thing, right? So there's the two indicator variables, FG and FGFFR, they represent like indicator variable that takes on value 1 if the monetary policy announcement is of an interesting type. So this regression, the baseline is the FFR announcement. So if you take the E here, like what you do in a metrics class, the beta 1 would kind of measure the difference in the average, the difference in the so-called, let's say beta 1 equals to E delta expectation when monetary policy is like FG minus like delta expectation when monetary policy is like baseline, condition on all these controls. So through this regression, we're in fact investigating whether there are kind of systematic variations between the 3 types of monetary policy announcements.
And then like you're using this one regression to analyze like the effect of 3 different, like they're not taking place at the same time, right? Like
they're not taking place at the same time. So we added kind of time fixed effect, and we also controlled for other variables. Like for example, this CI is like a vector of other expectations at the same time.
Okay.
Yeah, but we acknowledge that this is a very rudimentary regression, and an issue is that we're only able to compare the relative magnitudes between the 3 types of announcements because we don't have reference data. Our data is not high frequency enough, so we won't be able to kind of arrive at a causal interpretation of announcement itself. But we can only compare between 3 types because we don't have the baseline of no announcements.
I
we only
see.
have macro data like monthly, but within a month, a lot of things can happen.
Okay, I see. That makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for the question. So we'll just move on to the next one. Okay, so this one. So this one is done by Sophie, Hannah, Arohi, Charles, and myself. And luckily, more of us are present. So I'll hand over my time to Sophie.
Hi, I just wanted to check that everyone can hear me well. So my name is Sophie, and I'll be starting off the presentation on our project, which was concerning negative interest rates, bank performance, and market expectations. Next slide, please, Yuzi. So first to address our motivations. So broadly, an NIRP or a negative interest rate policy is associated with lower bank profitability in the long run because low interest rates will render the expected return on some investments, for example, say like unsecured overnight lending, not worth the associated capital costs. So the purpose of our project was to evaluate how announcements that introduce negative interest rate policies, for example, like those that occurred in June of 2014 as regards the EU announcements, shape market expectations for bank profitability and as interpreted through stock prices, and to determine if these expectations are accurate to reality. And so some questions we are considering are how impactful such announcements are, how their impact is reflected in the aftermath in the stock market, and do consumer expectations align with the reality?
So regarding the data set, we used the Thomson One database to collect data, and we collected two main sets of data. So the first was data regarding the stock prices of the banks before and after the NIRP announcement. And then the second set was data regarding the banks themselves to see if like the metrics of the banks had any effect on the impact of the announcement. So these were things like net assets, total debt / equity, the price and book value, to see when we run the linear regressions if they have any effect.
And we also want to note that when we were trying to find which banks we wanted to use in order to perform our regression, that we specifically separated them into two categories, those being banks in the European Union and then non-EU banks, in our case specifically Sweden, because we wanted to have sort of an exterior control in the case of, so that it wouldn't be just that a single group of banks with, you know, a single set of impacts would be the basis of the studies. We also wanted, you know, Sweden, which announced a negative interest rate policy at a different period of time in order to account for that possible factor. And the reference indices that we employed were the SOX Europe 600 and the S&P Europe 350.
Okay, so yeah, so just to clarify a little bit, so this project is kind of still in the run. So we will report the methodology we intend to employ, but results-wise, we're still kind of in the process of running the results, and we hope, you know, we'll be able to share with you guys at a later date once it's out. So we employ an event study methodology that leverages on so-called cumulative normal returns model. So the idea is that we kind of restrict our study window to -2 days to -3 days to +2 days, which is like 5 days window surrounding the announcement of the model of the policy change. And for each individual bank under study, we calculate the cumulative abnormal returns under during this period. So the idea is that we, first of all, we collect data like from the date of announcement and kind of match it with the stock index of reference to generate like estimates of coefficients for individual banks in a simple expected return model. And with that, we calculate the expected returns of the individual bank during the announcement period, the window of study, and based on this expected return model, and we calculate the cumulative normal returns over the entire period of study, the entire 5-day window. Okay. So the regression we intend to run would be of something of this type. So basically, this is also like a difference type of thing. So an announcement is an indicator variable to take some value 1. It operates if the bank operates in the EU monetary union, and if not, right, which is like in Denmark or something, it would take on value 0. And xi is a vector of bank-specific characteristics like asset levels, PE, debt, and percentage of interest rate income as percentage of total income. Okay, yeah. So hopefully the variable of interest is also beta 1, which can be interpreted as the kind of difference between the treatment group and the control group. Right? The treatment group is like those banks that operates in the EU monetary union, and the control groups are those banks that do not operate in the EU monetary union. So the idea is that if you operate in the EU monetary union, you're likely to be affected more by the negative interest rate change, because that's by the ECB. Yeah, so we will also conduct the following robustness checks, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, it's very exciting. And we hope to share with you guys the results once they are, we've made more progress.
And thank you for your attention.
Awesome. So thank you very much. And I think Lisi is your group member with the internet difficulties here, or if not, then I guess you guys can.
Yeah, we're gonna present without him.
Okay.
Okay, Ben, you want to share?
Yeah.
Lisi, you've got the.
Can you enable my screen sharing?
Yes.
So we are. So our goal was to kind of model risk analysis behavior of private equity fund managers, specifically with regards to foreign exchange, and especially in emerging markets, because when you're investing abroad, you have a variety of issues, but we'll get into that through motivation.
And just to introduce like a few things that we might abbreviate from now on in this presentation. Forex stands for foreign exchange. Emerging market private equity might sometimes be abbreviated to EM, PE, or emerging market might be abbreviated to EM, or PE, private equity might be abbreviated to PE. So this is what these things stand for.
Yeah. Well, that will get started.
Okay, so I mean, we kind of said this before, but the motivation has not changed the last time we presented. So there's the classic paper by Chicago, Bob Lucas, Why Doesn't Capital Flow from Rich Countries? And basically, one of the reasons why we think this might be true, or one of the reasons we try to investigate, is that investing in a country involves taking your money, which is in, let's say, dollars, and turning it into some asset that is denominated in the currency of said country. So a traditional solution would be to hedge the risk. So in general, this has to do with intertemporal choice and insurance. And we basically identified a segment of the market where we thought there's an incomplete market for hedging solutions. It's not clear if it's incomplete. And this is partly what Ben is going to talk about.
Yeah, so we went through the process of doing a lot of literature review and talking to market participants and that sort of thing. And at first, our kind of a priori diagnosis of the problem was that there was either an incomplete market for hedges, there's simply one side of the market is not participating, or PE fund managers are not acting rationally in that they're not properly assessing the risk they face and just like the net utility or just bottom line cost basis and like net returns that they're expecting. So we talked to a bunch of fund managers or not necessarily fund managers, but people offering hedges and people looking to hedge and that sort of thing. And turns out that it's essentially the market has really low volume because PE in an emerging market is not really all that active, even though it is a growing and fairly large industry in itself. But the hedging market for those fund managers is even smaller. So and with that, there's not a lot of information, not a lot of experience. So it's an inefficient market to keep it short. And then basically fund managers see that there's really high costs, risk in actually performing and implementing the hedges, and then just general complexity makes it so that they are risk averse and prefer even not to engage with hedges, even though it might decrease their volatility and returns. So then we shifted to trying to develop a model for the decision-making process, trying to incorporate all different aspects of the costs to see how this decision-making process might be might go and how we can maybe prescribe ways to change current available instruments and see where the market could be improved in terms of efficiency.
Okay, so this model, this is our model. I'm going to walk through it. It might seem a bit tautological because it kind of is, but the point of the tautology is to say that the costs are not very straightforward. And this is kind of the whole point, like the delicacy of the matter is on the next slide, where we will actually try to break down the cost of hedging and the cost of not hedging. But basically the model is a decision-based model. We have the firm making a decision if it chooses to hedge, if it doesn't choose to hedge. There's some information that the firm has about the cost of hedging or not hedging. This information might include things that are observable, like market prices, but are also unobservable, like
reputational risk, if leases further NIRP me, I can't really tell.
So we define two variables that are the cost of hedging and the cost of not hedging, and then we tautologically say that they're going to decide to hedge if the costs of hedging are less than the cost of not hedging, and they're going to decide not to hedge if the opposite holds. So I'll give it up to Ben, but basically it's very important to understand that these things are random variables depending on the information, and I mean not just depending on the information. It's kind of like there might be other things.
It'll make sense if you have some detail though. So
yeah.
So in each cost function, there's the random variables, but there's a wide variety of things we see. So we have like identified kind of like structures of each individual variable, and there's like several components denoted here with the superscript I or one of like, or their I is integer, and we go forward from there. The assumption here is that we're doing a transformation back to the same cost basis, but to go through some examples, in the cost of hedging, we see that there's pretty explicit costs in terms of like servicing fees. So what your bankers, lawyers, or financial advisors would charge you to help you implement the hedge. There's explicit costs from the premiums of the insurance contracts, transaction costs of just simply like what a broker would charge to sell you the hedge if it's a exchange traded derivative. And then there's also less explicit costs like liquidity restrictions, where because you're a PE fund and you have you're expending some of your capital reserve to buy hedges, you're not allowed to deploy that capital then into your investments by mandate, and then you reduce your returns and that sort of thing. And then also the explicit, or the implied effect of the hedge is that the limited upside for returns, because if a hedge operates properly, then it won't you won't be able to have the outsized returns in the in the 3 sigma event on the positive side. And then similar on the other side, we have the direct effect of hurdle rates, but also if there's this really intangible effect of default risk, or risk of failing to produce returns for investors, and then that could hurt the PE fund manager's future compensation and then utility and that sort of thing. So there's a wide variety of costs here, and it's a little bit of a struggle to pin down the specific effects and then also put them together into one decision tree. So
just one thing before you move the slide, I just want to remark, right? In a typical economic model, the only costs you see are premia, right? There's no other costs involved in hedging. So I just want to say there's a lot more frictions in the market we're considering than a typical economic model would consider. The point being, what we thought was an incomplete market is actually complete because the frictions are very big. So moving on to the next slide. Basically, we specify some sort of exchange rates for the things that are not explicitly dollar denominated, and then we sum them up. And the one thing that's kind of like lurking in the background here is that we're saying that utility can be measured in dollars in some level, negative utility in that case, which is a structural assumption. And that's all that we'll say about the model.
So given that we do have some estimates for the costs and trying to define each of the C's, CHCs, C sub H, super I that we have. So going into that, we have our group members. I think we're going to start with Ricky. You there?
Yeah. So Johnson et al. 2006. These researchers did a research about the cost of hedging versus not hedging for real estate private equity firms. So basically, in their research, they did a paper, they did a simulation with 10,000 private equity firms where they perform either no hedge for currency risk, and they hedge the initial purchase price and rental income, or they hedge the expected terminal value and rental income. So the expected terminal value is the value of a real estate asset sort of at the end of the investment period. So it is, so usually like it's calculated with a terminal multiple or a growth formula where you have like the cash flow divided by the growth rate. So so that's basically hedging sort of the final expected future value of the real estate asset. And they found that the chance of a negative NPV, the net present value, which is the present value of all of the value of the real estate assets, so including all the cash it can generate and its terminal value. So they found that the chance of the NPV for no hedge, hedge the initial purchase price, and hedge the expected terminal value is 16.53%, 2.9%, and 3.36% respectively. So basically, you can see that if you don't perform a hedge, then your chances of getting a negative NPV, so you're basically having a loss on your investment, is way higher than when you hedge. Yeah, next slide. Yeah, and here is the results table for the research. So we can see that the interval for not hedging for the NPV is way wider than hedging, and we calculated 95% confidence interval for the mean NPV for all the three options, and we basically found that the variance in returns of hedging is lower than the variance in returns of not hedging, which means that sort of hedging is a really good strategy to sort of lower the investment risk. Next slide.
Yeah, so this is just a quick slide, basically based on our conversations with people in the industry and documents we've obtained surrounding deals of a similar nature to a hedge a PE firm would potentially set in a developing market. Essentially, the costs for service fees outside of actually the premium paid on the hedging instrument are generally on the order of $200,000 to $1 million US, with basically the larger hedges. Obviously, just by math, the larger hedges are going to be proportionally cheaper because the fees will kind of max out, whereas smaller hedges will be proportionally more expensive, just to smooth income for the firms. And essentially, this is broken into three main categories, with kind of preliminary fees being about 25%, just analysis, pricing of prospective hedge before any money gets exchanged. And then about 50% of the fees come in the form of deal contingent advisory fees, in which things are documented, executed, et cetera, because many of these hedging instruments are tailor-made and are not traded on public exchanges, or at least ones which would be useful for a private equity firm. And then finally, you just have kind of general retainer fees, which are paid throughout the entire life of the deal or the hedge, which are the last 25%.
And another thing to know that's interesting here is that some of these contracts are hedging amounts up to like $10 billion US, and still the fee size is relatively limited. So it's a relatively fixed cost compared to the level of the volume and what's at stake, and yet firms tend to still avoid entering into these contracts because they're kind of averse to bringing in outside people and that sort of thing. And that's just through survey data from not regulatory bodies, but in industry conglomerate like associations in emerging market private equity.
Yeah, and so then just an additional slide. So as we would predict, liquidity costs depend on, the availability and riskiness of the said security. So this is just some data on tier 2 versus tier 1 securities. And then liquidity premiums of fixed income securities are much lower since they're less risky and much more liquid, which is supported by a paper from McCullough.
Cool. So the last cost we were trying to estimate is the actual effect on ability to clear hurdle rates and implied through the the depreciation on the assets. We didn't really explain it very clearly earlier, but essentially when you invest in a emerging market, you're investing in local currencies, but you have to return the money in USD or any traditional reserve currency. So
one thing before you say this, can you say what a hurdle rate is?
Oh, okay. So a hurdle rate is a percentage of return that a fund manager needs to pass, hence the name hurdle, in their portfolio, in their investment portfolio, before they can get paid. So and that's the fixed amount, or that's the fixed percentage that they have to return to their limited their own investors before they can receive any success-based compensation, which is kind of implicit in like the compensation structure for PE fund managers, and therefore would affect their decision-making process. In general, PE fund managers actually don't really care if they lose money, or how much money they lose if they don't clear their hurdle rate, which is pretty funny. But going into the actual calculations here, if to continue the explanation, if somebody is investing in a local currency, have to return their money to LPs, their own investors in US dollars, for example, and the US dollar appreciates with respect to local currency, it'll eat into the returns that you see in the local economy. For instance, if I'm an investor in Nigeria, and this is a conversation that we actually had, he's a VC fund manager. In 3 years, he achieved 300% returns in his portfolio, but the Nigerian lira also depreciated 300% over the time period with regard to the US dollar, with respect to US dollar. So net result was 0% returns in US dollar denominated portfolio, which is obviously very bad for the fund manager and affects his ability to raise future funds and that sort of thing. So going to that, to the general way to calculate depreciation is to look at yield curves and then find a difference over time. So essentially, if basically the cost basis for acquiring currencies is the bond, the local government bonds. So in the second column from the left, you see different 10-year bond rates and yields in BPS and basis points. So 100 basis points is 1%. So the Colombian peso or the Chilean peso in the first row is about 3.5%. No, sorry, 35. No, that's 3.5%. Yeah, 3.5% return for a 10-year yield for a 10-year bond, and then for the short-term local government bonds, you as expected, you'd see a lower rate, and you can calculate the difference between the U.S. government bonds to find the implied depreciation, and this tends to hold historically too with actual floating exchange rates. So it is just kind of industry standard way to calculate depreciation. So if you go down the list of, and we focus on Latin American countries, just to narrow scope, but two notable ones are ARS, the Argentinian peso. It's really famous for having severe depreciation. You see that reflected in the bond markets. And then I'm forgetting the currency name, but the Bolivian currency has actually is expected to appreciate with respect to the US dollar. And it's kind of like a pathological case where the relationship breaks down. But in general, you can see that depreciation is pretty severe. And given that private equity funds have returns between 20 to 30% per year over the course of their fund, depreciation in these ranges could significantly hurt ability to clear hurdle rates. So, and I think that is all we have for you today, unless Lizzie wants to talk about this.
No, we've already said this, and we're way over time.
All right, well, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. So with that, kind of, I guess, virtual round of applause to all of our cohorts and cohort leaders. Thank you all so much for the work that you've done this past year, and join us next week for the remainder of our cohort presentations. And with that,